like to do is to remind you to please hashtag with VR Rises. I have another 5 of these lovely apparatus to give out. So VR Rises, and to the people who won before, you can still hashtag accordingly, but don't mess up my game here, okay? All right, so as you see, VR is really, really hot, and I'm really excited about this next panel. Yes, please.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first panel, which is Frontiers in Storytelling, VR. I'm Larry Baffia. I'm from the Center for Digital Media here. And we've been dabbling a little bit with the Oculus and some VR work, but I think we've got a really exciting panel here that will be telling you about all sorts of ways the new language of storytelling is coming out with VR. So we've got an action-packed afternoon, so you're really not here to hear me. I'm going to introduce our panelists so we can get into it quickly. We've got two fellows from Cinehackers who did a wonderful film called I Am You. So as you can see up on the screen, we've got Alex Kondratsky as well as Ellie Rainey, and they'll be telling us a little bit about how they got into VR. Chris Edwards, as well as Chris Edwards from the third floor, as well as the virtual reality company, and I just found out he also has a third company, and Joseph Chen, who is from Verse, but via Oculus as a product developer there as well. So, gentlemen, we can have the two Cinehackers up, and you can lead us into that.
Hi, I'm Alexander Kondratsky. This is Ellie. I'm a VR developer. I'm a software developer by trade, and I got interested in VR early on when the first Kickstarter came out, and slowly with experimentation and through various meetups, we met up with Ellie.
And I'm a traditional filmmaker. I made a bunch of short films. I made a couple of low-budget feature films, and I got interested in VR. It was around the time when the DK1 came out, and Oculus was going to all these film festivals and showing people the Rift.
Mm-hmm. Technical difficulty.
We're not getting your signal here.
Okay. All right. Sorry. So yeah, it was when Oculus were going around and showing everyone the Rift, and I got really interested in seeing if I could make a film in VR, and that's when I met Alex.
Right. So we talked about what is the current way that people produce content for virtual reality, and the predominant way was 360 video, where you shoot a sphere around the person, and as they're viewing it, they can turn around and look what they're looking at. But as a director, Ellie found that
well, it's difficult, right? I mean, there are ways, and I'm sure the other panelists will talk about it, sound cues and things to direct the attention of the viewer, but and giving them agency. But I was thinking about the director, and if the director wants you to look in a particular direction, how could you achieve that? So we had a couple GoPro cameras, and Alex was talking to me a lot about stereo and how that's much more immersive than just 2D video. Mm-hmm. And the reason we didn't do 3D 360 is because it's quite a difficult process, and Alex can speak about that.
So we adopted a point of view approach because it was easier to work with, to be agile, since we didn't need to stitch. So what we would do is essentially shoot from the perspective of the actor, record where they're looking, and the viewer then gets to experience it through the character's eyes. If the actor or character looks left, then the viewer follows along with the story.
And that really worked for me as a director because I could choreograph the actors to look where we wanted, and they were actually the camera for the film. So it was a really interesting approach. So the film, and we're going to show you a clip from it so you can see what we're talking about. It was certainly for us a film, but it was a research project as well to figure out how to make a film and do storytelling in VR. So just Control F.
And it's just gonna go? Gonna go?
Yeah, I think so.
My stomach feels really weird. I can't believe this actually worked.
Oh my god.
This is it. This is it.
So I don't know how you guys felt about that scene, but what we've noticed when a lot of people have watched it is they feel really uncomfortable. Yeah, but for some reason on the screen it doesn't feel like anything like that. Oops, sorry.
Uncomfortable in the sense that it's very intimate and
Yeah.
they're not used to that experience.
Right, like people feel like they're actually touching the other person.
Right.
So yeah, so that's the project, and that's what we did.
Thanks.
All righty. So I have a little presentation here. So our company, the third floor, comes from when we were on the third floor of George Lucas's Skywalker Ranch house and making a movie called Star Wars Episode 3, which is still the latest Star Wars movie released. I can still say that for just a little longer. So over 12 years ago, we were hanging out, working directly with George on designing the movie before they shot with the actors. And this was something that we did for the entire movie, over 7,000 shots, all done and designed digitally before they shot the plates. Of course, this was done with little doodles from George and Stephen themselves. And even napkins were used to convey ideas. So since those days, we kept the team together and we formed the third floor in Los Angeles initially, and it has become the world's largest pre-visualization studio. So that means that we're designing major feature films like these and also television shows like Game of Thrones. And here's a short clip of some of our more recent hits. of this is imagery we're designing in real time. And we do this in many other mediums, like in video game cinematics, designing for large franchises all around the world. And so it was only a natural fit for us to start getting into the development of real-time imagery for other mediums, including virtual reality. Because what we design becomes very clearly very close to what the final product looks like. So for years we've been dabbling in this, but we really, over the last 2 years, started amping up our reconnaissance and workforce into what the game engines can do. And when the virtual reality headsets came out after that, it was the perfect excuse to develop this technology further. And so the first thing we noticed is that when you take the sets that we were designing for filmmakers and start putting them into the game engine, you get all this free, very detailed lighting and bounce light that you were never able to do before in Maya and basic packages, at least in real time. And you look at what the games industry itself was doing, and it's very, very detailed, approximating the level of detail that a finished visual effects company could achieve, yet this is done 90 frames a second instead of an hour per frame. So really incredible that we saw that there's definitely a merging between the worlds of film and the worlds of gaming. So with the film on one side and games on the other side, in the middle, I believe, is VR and later AR or augmented reality technology. So on one side, we're used to producing more passive narratives, meaning that the audience is watching whatever the director has created. On the other side, you have the extreme of fully open world, totally interactive spaces in gaming. And so what we're interested in doing is creating sort of a semi-interactive narrative experience, which I think fits squarely in the middle, using the advantages and the language of both sectors of our entertainment industry. And there's so many different companies creating amazing hardware that we're very blessed to get excited about VR, yet not a lot of directors creating VR currently. So we set up another company called VRC, the virtual reality company, to specifically design these types of experiences, which we call premium story-driven VR content. We announced ourselves in the Wall Street Journal a while back, and what we were announcing is that we had joined forces with a couple of iconic filmmakers and many others actually beyond this, that we are currently working on their first offerings in virtual reality. And everyone is excited. All these filmmakers, our partners, friends, and colleagues in the industry are excited about the rapid adoption of consumer technologies. If you look at over the last several years, there's a lot of people getting increasingly excited about quickly adopting that technology into their worlds. I mean, you see it with your children as well. And so we're thinking that the rate of adoption of VR is going to be fairly rapid. And this is it's not a market that you shouldn't, it's a market that you definitely need to take a look at, because it's going to be somewhere in between, if not even bigger than some of these multi-billion-dollar industries eventually. But we need to be all part of the adoption process of VR, and we need to create really good experiences. So I always say we don't have competitors. All we have is, if there's other people creating excellent VR, then they're our comrades in arms creating great examples of VR, and we need more of it. So I believe that it is inherently more interesting if you do a great VR experience to be literally inside the experience and to participate to some extent than potentially simply watching a movie. So it's a powerful tool, and that's what we're gearing up to do. More on that later. Cheers.
Let's see, how do I do this? Escape? All right, cool. All right. I'll bring this up and just kind of have it on pause for a second. Pause, please. There we go. Alt F, maybe. Oh, Alt Enter, sorry. There we go. Hey, I'm Joe. Quick introduction, get to the meat of this discussion. I was formerly at Oculus, one of the first people over there, recruited by a 19-year-old Palmer Luckey to join a then 10-person company working on cardboard and duct tape VR goggles for gaming. I didn't have any experience in gaming. I hadn't played a game in 10 years. Worked primarily in product development, and at the time was working on augmented reality, which is why Palmer and I had a conversation at a conference recently, at the time. Since then, it's been about 2 years. Facebook, $2 billion. I think Anna spoke to that earlier. And I now find myself at Verse, where we're able to explore technology from a more creative perspective. And that was really my drive to move from Oculus to Verse to work with creatives as the technical advisor, technical liaison. A lot of my day basically involves discussing and workshopping ideas creatively with these directors, or creators as we call them, to figure out what the core emotion or point they're trying to elicit out of their audience is, and then how do we best technically deliver that within the constraints of what technology is currently available. So without further ado, I'll just give you a quick synopsis of some of our earlier work. So this is Evolution of Verse, the first piece we launched at Sundance, I'd say about a year ago. This is Walking New York in collaboration with the New York Times. This is Waves of Grace, one of our more recent productions in collaboration with the United Nations. This is Saturday Night Live. This is the 40th anniversary episode. And this is Clouds Over Sidra, probably one of our very first experiences at a Syrian refugee camp in Jordan, also with the United Nations. This is a more commercial project. That's Nike, the Neymar Jr. effect, where we kind of put you inside of Neymar's body. So lights back up. And so that's probably represents maybe about a quarter of our work so far, and we're always looking to try to basically evolve VR as a medium for creative storytelling as opposed to just technology for tech demos. So with that, yeah, let's do it.
Great, thanks guys. So as you can see, there's quite a variety of ways to tell stories there. There were a few traditional touches there and some very experimental things. And one of the first things is, when we talk about 360 films and we start talking about storytelling, all of a sudden a lot of the original components of filmmaking kind of go out the window because we're not just talking about the film frame anymore. So let's talk a little bit about how you have that initial approach of planning. How do you get your narrative across? How do you get your viewer engaged? And what about these puppet controls that Anna was alluding to? How much of a puppet master do you have to be to get your story going?
I can dive in there. I think the most critical thing really is to nail the concept. That's what we work on a lot in pre-production rather. It isn't quite storyboarding so much as it's designing kind of a sphere or a bubble or a landscape, and understanding that with the loss of frame, that your audience has basically control over everything in terms of where they're looking. And so therefore, while it doesn't also all have to be compelling, it all has to be relevant. You can no longer just black out the back. There is no backstage. And figuring out how to take advantage of that initially as a immersion, from an immersion perspective, is probably that first step. Mm-hmm. I think beyond that, as we evolve into like concurrent or linked narratives or maybe even branch narratives, there can be multiple things going on in that environment. And really, it just takes that initial consideration in terms of like, why is the viewer here? What is interesting about this, and how is this going to lead towards the next point? And giving them at least not necessarily the illusion of choice, but the choice of where they want to pay attention to.
I see. Chris?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are confused about how to direct in VR because we're so used to directing for the rectangle. I think I heard your boss talk about that. Mm-hmm. And that is a great advantage to directors to be able to explicitly show the audience what they want to see at every frame that they want to see it. But there are other ways to direct action, and you actually have to go back before cinema to what is theater. You know, theater, there's amazing theater directors that have the ability to capture your attention, take you on a journey by moving people and objects around, playing with lighting, doing sound cues. You know, all of that is equally as powerful as just pointing your camera in a certain direction. And then if you layer on top of that the director's ability to decide in advance whether you want it to be a participant, like literally you have a a body, so you feel like you're there, or if you're just a fly on the wall, like an omniscient observer. And then it gets really interesting when you start to mix the two and you decide, okay, well, you know, I'm going to start off this story just by being an observer, and where you don't feel like you need to be tethered to any particular point in VR. You can cut around, you can show different perspectives, and then maybe at some pivotal emotional point, you want to experience it from either a innocent bystander perspective, or perhaps you are, like in your film, you know, one of the main characters. So this is all very interesting, this sort of pseudo uncharted territory, but I think that's part of the beginning of the language of VR.
And you guys dealt with the frame sort of in a unique way as well.
Yeah. Is this on? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think for us, we really tried to do a hybrid approach, like traditional as well as innovative. I know that from what I've seen, nobody has really done this type of approach before, where they're just moving the camera the way we did it. But I think it gives it a different language and a different feeling. So, but we talked a lot about how we tell a story, how to tell a story in 360, and the limitations of that.
Yeah, the normal cinematography approach doesn't really work. You can't, for example, do pans and the usual dolly moves that you would do in a usual motion picture. So that really forced us to design the experience. How will you lead the viewer through the story? Another problem was for us is because you're immersed and you can't do, it's very difficult to do cuts. The whole experience had to be choreographed. So in terms of planning to shoot, we really needed to choreograph the actors through the whole experience to set it up.
Yeah, there's definitely an emphasis on pre-production and prep with your actors, or with the blocking of a scene if there's CG elements. But I would beg to differ just a little bit in terms of the dollying. You know, you definitely can move the camera. That's one of the things that I think was, you know, a lot of companies were fearful of, because initially, before they had
my fault.
kind of nailed, before they had nailed the frame rates in certain ways to fool your brain into not feeling as uncomfortable or motion sick in the VR space. There was trepidation to go there, but we started moving the camera in linear directions and then getting a little more bold here and there. And so there's definitely things you can do. And that's part of what I think is going to be the renaissance of VR, is who's going to move the camera in new and interesting ways, and how. Because, you know, a VR live action camera should look in all directions. So where's the crew? What's holding the camera? So a lot of people are talking about drones. A lot of people are moving cameras with little robots. There's a lot of post-production going on to remove these things and replace them. So it's interesting.
Well, that sort of resonates with Matthew Grassner talked a lot about that when he was making The Mission, and the fact that VR still is sort of in that risk mode as far as what is cinematography and what is motion and where is that screen direction, right? Joe, you were saying?
Oh yeah, no, exactly. it's hard for me as a formerly being at Oculus and having this very purist mindset about real-time engine and cameras and the kind of hard line of the quote-unquote best practices at the time. Don't move the camera. Always have camera control tied in with the head, which I think is still probably accurate for the most part. And then actually getting a lot more practical once you actually work with the content and realizing that maybe you can get a little bit adventurous, you can experiment a little bit here, but for a specific reason. I mean, there has to be an underlying reason. You don't want to throw a dolly shot or a pan in just to have it, right? We experiment with drones. We had a dolly shot, I think, in New York Times. There's all sorts of mechanisms that we can draw from cinema, and also, as Chris mentions, theater, that may or may not work. And it's really about finding, what we've had success with, I hope, is finding directors that have kind of a wealth of experience with these techniques, but are willing to kind of forget about their initial assumptions about how well they will work or won't work in VR, and then test, fail, and then ultimately ship.
Chris?
I just wanted to say, I think this is like another one of those potential renaissance periods. I mean, like, remember back in the early days of cinema where there was the big refrigerator-size cameras, and they had to blimp them for the sound quality to be good. And then all of a sudden, someone had created a smaller camera, and there are people running around doing handheld cinematography. So the tools actually enabled filmmakers to do new and innovative things with the art. And I think we're at another one of those crossroads right now.
You know, another thing that a filmmaker has as far as control with the frame is the fact that it can evoke emotion. And Ellie, you were asking about the emotion that we had, and was whether or not we were uncomfortable with looking down at the hands, for example. You know, and there is the power in the close-up or the cutting from a very wide scene to a close-up to get that particular reaction shot and things like that. How do you control the rise and fall of emotion through a narrative in a 360 world?
Yeah, I can't speak to the 360 world in this film, but we tried, like I said, with our technique to really create an emotion output with the frame where we were looking. I think that was that's the conversations we had early on of how do we create those emotions and how do we provoke those things, and that kind of led us down this experimental rabbit hole.
I think the way we approach it is trying to see how would they react in the scene. So when you think of theater versus cinema, you're getting closer and closer to the characters. So in a cinema, you can get that close-up shot, whereas in a theater, for perhaps you sit quite far and the acting might be more exaggerated to get across that emotion. With VR, we found the acting had to be more subtle, more natural, because you're right there with the characters.
We also picked a really small location as well to make it feel more intimate.
Yeah, it kind of makes you go for a more minimalistic setup in terms of the set and how you act.
We were thinking about introducing sort of a rating system for the intensity of VR experiences, and I mean, you could think of that multiple ways of, like, what's the content in the traditional R, PG-13, PG kind of rating, but I think the more appropriate rating scale for VR is about emotional intensity, for the most part. And there's definitely a big variety. There can be very calming experiences where you're just literally in the rainforest, and it's a great place to do your yoga in the morning. And that's a very disarming experience. Or you can be very voyeuristic, or you can be directly engaged by the other characters in the story, so you feel like you're maybe being chased or interrogated. I mean, there can be some pretty intense emotions that I think can go beyond the threshold of what you normally can achieve in a feature film.
Yeah, you sort of have to find that balance where the element of surprise has to be at a certain level so we don't have the first VR heart attack or what have you out there.
I think we're trying for that with the piece that we decided to show today. It's catatonic. It's out there. It's kind of a creep show through a hospital asylum. So try it out. It's one of the first things that we did earlier. And but back to what Ellie and Alex were mentioning, I think there are some really interesting points specific to VR. One is that you are present with this person, and if anyone's ever been on a set, which I'm assuming most of you have, acting shows. It just comes out. Like, you can tell when someone's acting, and it looks pretty hammy most of the time when you're actually sitting next to them. Conveys much differently on a rectangular frame. So a lot of what we do ends up being almost scripted documentary. You have to really just let that person be and be very subtle with that direction. And I think ultimately that's what our directors strive for. Also, that sense of place, the intimacy that you guys described and captured in your piece, it's something that can easily be played with. Granted, you have to set design in 360, of course, but that sense of proximity, that sense of closure, that maybe even claustrophobia, fundamentally changes when an environment opens up and opens out to like a wide open space. Also, the close-up that you mentioned, it is definitely something that is powerful. Especially given the technology we have right now with the headsets, the resolution isn't fantastic. So in order to understand the subtleties of someone's facial expressions, like right now, am I nervous? Am I shaking? Am I twitching? Is there something that's like, am I keeping a secret? Those types of like subtle emotions as opposed to the gross happy or sad that is a little bit easier conveyed without that.
One thing I wanted to mention is that there's definitely different advancements in VR that create these sort of categories of experiences. So one big way you can look at it is what's called a 3 degrees of freedom experience versus a 6 degrees of freedom. And if for all you users of Maya and CAD programs out there, you know that there's XYZ rotation, 3 degrees, or XYZ translation plus rotation. That's the 6 degrees we're talking about. So 6 degrees means you can move inside the VR envelope. And for that, it requires more sophisticated tracking, not just turning your head. Currently, you're not seeing anything more than just 3 degrees of freedom on the phone-based mobile platforms. You have to go to the mainstream Oculus or the HTC Vive or Morpheus, or I should say PlayStation VR platforms in order to have that sort of 6 degrees movement functionality. And that is where it starts to get really interesting for me, is in that 6 degrees world, because it really is like you're blocking a space in which the viewer moves or could choose to move. And there's certain things you can do as a director to literally, like, with some certainty, position the viewer where you want them to look. For example, you can be in a black void and the participant looks up and they see in the middle of the room that there's a shaft of light that comes down on a mystery box. And you're like, oh, that's interesting. Well, you can probably guarantee that that person's going to lean in and start looking at the box, and then as they get closer to it, maybe it opens up. And yet they hear something, but they hear it around behind them, right? Because you can do binaural, completely positional sound. So they look behind them, and by the time they look back, the object that was in there is gone. So you literally are playing out this sort of live action theater experience, which makes it really interesting.
Yeah, I think a lot of that stagecraft is necessary at this point, because we have to consider the audience. It's similar to the early days of silent films. Most people would have been running out of the theater as that train was approaching camera, or the cowboy points the pistol straight at the camera, right? Are we still sort of in that audience response strata as far as VR, the early days of VR?
I'd say yes. I mean, the audience is really pretty. It's new. It's almost naive. It's like what I saw at Oculus, basically, getting involved with a lot of these earlier marketing activities around VR, whether that was Game of Thrones or whatnot, is that the general public, when they see VR for the first time, regardless of whether the experience is good or somewhat less good, they're still wowed by it. The technology kind of takes them back, right? So, or takes them aback, right? So, I think really but that's going to progress quickly. I think next year, the years coming, that audience is going to become much more sophisticated, and it's ultimately up to creators and directors to evolve the medium creatively in order to take advantage of it. Otherwise, we end up with a lot of technology gimmicks.
Yeah, the first reaction, oh wow, I can see my feet, right?
We thought about that as well when we were making our film, because, you know, obviously we made it for general audience, and the experience starts off in a cinema, and it's where everyone actually watches a film, and then when they're brought into VR, then it actually, you know, really kicks in. But we didn't know we didn't know how people would feel, so that we really tried to experiment with that.
Right, and it also feels like, because it's early stage right now, are things that make people uncomfortable, are they always going to be uncomfortable, or will audiences eventually get that language and actually become completely used to it, and it will advance past that? And something to experiment.
Absolutely, I think that's critical. Audience evolution is just as rapid as technology evolution, and I think creatively we have to iterate to keep up with that. We've tried a host of different things. Again, we test and test, and a lot of the stuff we do doesn't work out that great, but that doesn't mean that it's verboten. It's not like off the best practices list. Like next year there could be a new technology, like Sixth Office, Chris mentions, that makes that work. Or maybe there's a different creative approach, or maybe the audience just gets used to it and it's okay. There are no absolutes, kind of, right?
I think, I mean, the great thing about VR is you can get whatever you want out of it. There are people that are going to be hardcore gamers that want to go in there and they, you know, do race car driving in VR, and it's going to be pretty intense. Other people are going to just want to sit around and watch a television show that has occasional 360 moments so that they feel a little bit more immersed in that. And all of those approaches for consumption of VR are totally valid. And I think you're going to see different studios and different camps kind of specializing in different techniques and feeding those sub-markets. But also I think that the social networking world and all of the various, you know, multiplayer networks will make people a little bit more comfortable with just generally interacting in VR faster than you might imagine. I mean, just look at how fast probably many of your children have been playing Minecraft and other massively multiplayer online worlds, and they're jumping around, and they know how to inherently look at their friends and collaborate, and they're building stuff together. Well, the next step very soon is going to be doing that with a headset on.
Yeah, the shared experience will be key. We're obviously looking at each other as we're conversing. It's no different than an audience sharing a laugh or what have you during a film. So what sort of mechanisms are you looking at for that shared experience?
I think
Surprise,
currently,
a tough question.
yeah, I think currently cinemas, in a cinema, it's a shared experience where people can go together to a theater and experience one version of the movie, whereas to some extent VR can be very personal, where every single person can experience a different version of that creation. But we were at Oculus Connect, and there was a really amazing demo where you would be in the same virtual space as another person, interacting, passing objects, and they would be in a completely different room and could potentially be across the globe. So perhaps in the future, you won't be restricted to, you know, a theater full of people watching an experience, but it could be, you know, millions of viewers interacting in a common space.
Yeah. Or you could take it interactively and actually have, I don't know. I'm just spitballing, but like actors, you know, virtually existing in the world, I don't know, in the space that you create, shooting that.
I think Chris had an interesting spectrum on one of his earlier slides, that being passive narrative versus interactivity, and how much identity or agency do you give to your viewer within that realm, and if that experience is shared, I mean, it complicates the narrative like multiple times over. So for the most part, we do live in that passive, and we are experimenting with different forms of agency, and some of that may be introducing a second or many characters that are actually populated by your real-life friends. That said, I think Anna mentioned all of these kind of dystopian futures, and that's my personal version of VR hell, because being on the inside, there's a certain stigma around VR being this metaverse, and for better or for worse, it may or may not be coming, but I think that there is something still valuable to the human interaction of the shared experience, that retelling of your differentiated experience. One of our directors is Felix Barrett of Punch Drunk, Sleep No More fame. So the idea that you can walk through this house and there's no way that you're going to experience the same thing that I experienced. We're all on very different different lines of that story, and afterwards, or even in the little break sessions, we get excited about different things, and that synthesis of what really resonated with you as the audience, I think ultimately makes that story more ownable. It makes it more personal. It makes it more intimate. It makes it yours, and that retelling of that story over and over again ultimately, hopefully, results in replays, so that you'll go back through it again, and you'll try it over and over again, and I'll try to simulate Ellie's run or Chris's run, and experiment and explore even more, and ultimately with Sixed Off that becomes immensely more complicated, and as a huge challenge for a storyteller to figure out how to guide an audience in a cohesive way through not just orientation and looking around, but if I can walk to the back of this theater, then this conversation becomes much more disjointed. How do we maintain that cohesion? So.
And any other thoughts of where you'd like to see this go in the near future as far as interaction?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to mention that I think that one of the most exciting things is devices that are being added to the VR world that allow you to move your hands and to do more sophisticated types of interaction, like you were alluding to with their demo. It's like, you know, even just being able to reach out and feel your arms and touch objects and make choices that way is a huge leap forward. But I submit that that is just the beginning of what we're about to experience. Later on, you'll be able to actually feel the objects that you're touching and sense the different roughness of the various objects. The next thing that I think you're going to see a lot of is your own expressions being recorded even though you're wearing a device on your face. You know, if you research some of the recent Oculus Connect feeds, you'll see some early research being done into that area, so that's what's really going to be critical for you to truly be a participant. Right now, we're seeing this early days, you know, almost demos of what's possible, but I think you're gonna need that in order to interact with other human beings or other AI characters, because you communicate not just through your movement, but through your micro expressions in your face. So that's gonna open up a whole new realm of possibilities.
Right. What excites you the most in the near future? What motivates you to continue in VR?
This will never happen. A paradigm shift of this magnitude in media will never happen in our lifetime, I believe. So that's kind of cool.
How about you guys?
One thing, as Chrissy said, is the utility of game engines. And I think that for the future of narrative storytelling in VR, there will be a sort of blurring between the passive experience of cinema and the interactive experience of games. And I think both media will be borrowing ideas from each other and seeing where that line gets blurred. And that's really exciting.
I think the technology tools are going to evolve. I mean, they're already evolving incredibly fast. Really just getting those tools, whether it's photogrammetry or light field capture or game engine, as game engines continue to get more and more powerful and efficient, to deliver that live action photorealism in a Sixed Off environment with agency. That in the hands of directors and creatives and artists that really understand what, or don't understand and are just trying to explore as possible. That's why I do it.
Great. We've just got a few minutes left, and maybe we should reach out to the audience, and there go the hands. We got plenty of questions out there.
There's only one mic, so.
Run.
Hello. There is a dark horse in the VR industry, and I'm guessing with the $99 headset, it's going to kind of explode. And not to be naive, but we know that this industry has driven a lot of innovation in the past, from VHS tapes to micropayments. You know where I'm going with this. That industry is porn, and I'm just very curious about what they are going to be doing that might impact what you're doing, and how the innovations and technology that might cross over. Very curious about that.
It's all yours.
Pass. There are some folks that are already, if you just search the news feeds, there are folks and companies in that space in the adult industries already looking at VR and how it's going to impact their business in the future. I think that there is a lot of technology that can be drawn from what we're doing and vice versa, whether that's human capture, rigging, mocap, whatever. But at the same time, I also, again, that technology is ever evolving. It's going to move faster than any one of us, I think, can even predict at this point. So for the most part, I see it having a massive impact on VR. I don't disagree with that at all, just from general consumption. But in terms of storytelling and what we do, really, that's the crux of it, storytelling. Why is this relevant? I mean, that audience has a reason for being there. Why is there a reason for someone to put on a VR headset and watch a documentary about the United Nations, or one of Chris's new pieces, or Ellie's next thing? Why am I actually donning this piece of equipment? And if you can land on that, and I think the adult industry has a compelling reason for someone to do so, then I think that we're successful ultimately as whether directors or technicians.
If this is all about storytelling in a VR world, do you have any suggestions or tips for writing scripts for this type of experience, or is it completely different from a traditional screenplay?
I'm prepared for this question. So I interrogated some of our writers, because we have writers on staff that are beginning to write VR experiences, and I'm like, why is it different than writing a traditional screenplay? And they said, well, normally we can be like Ted Kaczynski and go into a cabin and create my manifesto, and I unveil it upon the director, not stepping on the toes of the director, because we don't want to put too much visual language in there, because that's what the directors do. But because VR is so visual, at least this one writer I was polling was saying that the writer has to work hands-on very often, collaborating with the director themselves, because it is really this handoff from story and blocking and the visual implementation of it. So that's my short answer.
With our experience, we worked very closely with the actors. We had a rough idea for the story, and they improvised the dialogue. And that helped them because they had to choreograph the movements, and we worked together on that. So we had a story idea and we had the beats, but we worked with the actors to create the dialogue, and that was really integral for our piece.
Yeah, we practiced a lot, went over the scene again and again, where we would basically grow the dialogue from the overall description rather than nailing the exact lines. Yeah. And it delivered a more natural, intimate experience.
And I think more because they had to also operate the camera rig, that it was difficult for them. So we just tried to make it as easy as possible.
Yeah, I think understanding what the audience is actually going to experience is pretty critical. You have to be able to imagine what that is ahead of time. Having a writer that gets that, and to be perfectly honest, we work with a lot of different folks, and the first thing I ask is, do you have a VR headset? Have you tried a VR headset? Have you tried any of our work in a VR headset? Because if they haven't, then, I mean, just watching that equirectangular video that you saw, it doesn't convey what's going on. You don't understand what that wrap seam is doing, what's going on behind you, what's going on in that that left quadrant. How do I craft that into the primary story, right? So I think that by putting yourself in the shoes of the audience, that writer will better be able to make decisions on whether or not it's first person, whether or not it's third person, whether or not you're just this casual observer, or if you're an active part of the narrative.
And also just in the CG realm, you can use different techniques to try experiences out. I mean, in the games world, they call this white boxing, where essentially you're making a bunch of levels of the game with placeholder objects. So being able to understand and test your audience beforehand, then you can see, oh, well, they're going to probably look at that, and then, oh, wait, you know what, they totally missed that whole area because they didn't know to turn there. Maybe we better do something writing-wise for the final take of this a little differently. So you do have to, like in games, kind of work in layers sometimes and build up your narrative.
Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Question for you. Virtual reality versus 360 technology. What is your interpretation of virtual reality? Are we using 360 technology in this platform, or is this shot virtual reality, like, for example, on the Red camera? What's your definition of virtual reality for the camera side?
I would say that virtual reality is just the big umbrella name to the entire industry of experiencing anything inside of a virtual world, whether that be live action footage or CG or some of both. The 360 videos that you're seeing are just a subset of that virtual reality landscape.
Yeah, I agree to that to a certain extent. Virtual reality is a big bucket. Coming from Oculus, the purist mindset is that it has to be real-time rendered. It has to have identity agency. You have to be able to impact the world. You have to be able to kick over this bottle in order for it to be virtual reality. Otherwise, it's just a playback or a video. And when I'm visiting those types of folks, then yes, I'm very, very honest about the fact that for the most part, I think 90% of our work is 360 3D video. But I think that is more of a constraint of the current technology than anything else. Right now, we use the current camera systems to act as constraints for our directors to work within in a passive narrative role. Now, as technology gets better and better with light field and game engine integration, then of course that becomes a much more advanced version of virtual reality, kind of more towards that interactive spectrum.
I think we got time for a couple more questions.
Thank you. What is the entry-level price point for beginning to experiment with VR? Is it too early to start talking about like low-budget VR filmmaking?
You'd be surprised.
There was a camera there's a bunch of products coming out, but there's the Ricoh Theta. It's a camera that's like, I think $350 or $450, and you can shoot 360 on that. There's a camera called the Sphericam, and it has 6 lenses and shoots up to 60 frames, which is great for a VR headset. And it'll come with a software utility that does auto stitching. So I think when you're looking at price for buying things, you also have to consider time as well, because you can buy GoPros, but it takes time to stitch those things together and learn to stitch. Yeah.
I mean, there's also the engine approach as well. So if you want to go directly into real time, then there's a lot of really affordable engines. I think most of these things are on a licensing system now.
But I think they're free.
Yeah,
Are they all free now?
Unity and Unreal.
Unity and Unreal are
Yeah,
free.
you can get into it pretty fast. Yeah. One last one?
This kind of ties into that question. I realize it's kind of, VR is still experimental, a lot of R&D, but we are starting to produce projects. And so for those of us who are concerned about money and timelines, do you have any advice for people who are venturing into storytelling in the projects in a VR project? And how on earth do we keep it on schedule and on budget?
Well, I think you have to have a good line producer, just like any other project. You shouldn't underestimate the amount of time that it might take to package up all the footage that you shot. So if you're there with whatever camera system, there might be a stitching phase, like my friends were saying here. That takes a lot of effort to do that. And also don't underestimate the importance of sound mixing. And this is something that is a little bit of a dark art to do this really well, and there's a lot of different techniques. I would recommend getting a group together that is experts in various aspects and say, well, what do you really need to do the sound for my experience, and what camera operator, what do you need? And really get those itemized budgets kind of locked down and then buffer it.
Yeah, as a producer, buffer, yeah, it's padded. Especially given, just be realistic with the clients. A lot of the time, we go through an education process with different clients and partners, especially partners. I mean, a lot of the times the expectation is that, oh, what's the difference between this and video, and them not understanding the realities of how much post is involved. That also impacts the budget, of course. So rule of thumb, I usually try to budget 40–50% towards post. Like, that's just where we live. So
in terms of time, we found, because a lot of it will be experimentation, we found an iterative approach to really help, where every week we would meet up and discuss our basically adopting an agile methodology.
Yeah, I mean, partnering with a software developer was, the best thing I could have ever done, because we really did take that sort of iterative approach to doing this experience, and like every milestone we had felt like a leap. So if you don't have a lot of money, just spend time. That's the only way to do it.
That's great. I know it's only the surface being scratched here, but we are out of time. I'd like to thank all four of you gentlemen. We're really looking forward to your next project. Cheers.